Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony Maricola. I'm the manager of Adult Services, Adult and Information Services, and on behalf of the library, welcome. Tonight we have a wonderful program. Author and architectural historian William J. Hennessey is with us. He's going to be presenting on his book, Fifth Avenue from Washington Square to Marcus Garvey Park. With over 300 images and graphic maps, the book presents an in-depth exploration of architecture along one of the world's most iconic streets, New York City's fabled Fifth Avenue. The publisher has generously offered a 20% discount on the book for tonight's attendees, and I will share that information in the chat. If you have any questions for our presenter this evening, please use the Q&A feature that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. William J. Hennessey is an architectural historian and an author who has taught at Vassar College, the University of Kansas, the University of Kentucky, and the University of Michigan, and directed the art museums at each of those institutions. From 1997 to 2014, he was director of the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia. Additionally, Mr. Hennessey has authored several catalogs and books on a wide range of art and design topics. Mr. Hennessey, thank you for being with the Stanford community this evening.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm excited. We have a walk up what is arguably one of the world's most famous streets tonight. And to get us started without more ado, I'm going to ask your indulgence for a second while I share my screen here. There we go. Okay. So Fifth Avenue, this is the book that Anthony mentioned just a few moments ago, and pretty much everything I have to say tonight and a great deal more is located inside that book. But with that, Fifth Avenue, stretching from 7 miles from Washington Square all the way up Manhattan to 142nd Street in Harlem. It's home to many of what people think of as the very best, the most elegant, the most sophisticated aspects of New York City. But you know, when you ask people what they think of Fifth Avenue, everyone has their own image that pops into mind. For example, many people think of it as a street of churches. Others would say, no. What really sets Fifth Avenue apart is it's the home of the very best hotels in New York City, and others would say, no, actually, it's a place where you'd go for there we go, skyscrapers. Some of the greatest in New York are located along there as well, or for shopping, great department stores. Others say, no, Fifth Avenue is a street for great public institutions, and of course, all these people are correct. Those things are all true about Fifth Avenue. But I think tonight what I'd like to do is argue with that before it's anything else, Fifth Avenue has always been a street on which to live, New York's most prestigious residential neighborhood. And that's true whether you live in one of these glorious apartment houses facing Central Park, or a brownstone downtown in a village, or an extraordinary mansion uptown. Now, to understand how this residential character came about, I think it probably makes sense for us to back up a little bit and talk about the development of Manhattan in general. You know, the city, as we know, grew from south to north, starting with a tiny Dutch settlement down there at the Battery on your left. And in the early days of New York, people lived and worked in close proximity. Their homes were near the docks, the warehouses, and the workshops that were the source of their income. And as a result of all of this, Lower Manhattan tended to grow in a kind of haphazard, willy-nilly fashion. Streets were built where they need to without any kind of pre-planning. But as cities do, as they grow, people began to separate their work and their living places. And as wealth accumulated, those who could afford it began to carve out residential enclaves away from the noise and the confusion of the business center. Broadway, of course, was the first to develop along these lines, but other streets followed. And soon, a familiar pattern emerged. As the city grew, commerce kept pushing ever farther to the north, and the wealthy, who wanted to be in the country, fled before it. Well, before too long, this haphazard pattern of development was getting out of control. And as a result, the city fathers decided that a comprehensive development plan was in order. And the result of that was the celebrated Commissioner's Plan of 1811. This was set out the development in Manhattan north of what's now Houston Street, all the way up to what's now 157th Street, based on a very rigid rectangular strict grid. Now, underlying this grid plan were some assumptions. For example, waterborne commerce and trade, that's really New York's raison d'etre, was concentrated along the water, at the edges of the city. And as manufacturing developed, things like tanneries, slaughterhouses, shipbuilding, foundries that needed water to also developed along the edges. This left the center of the island on high, dry, far away from the noise and the dirt of the rivers, as choice residential territory. So it's no surprise that when the Commissioner's Plan was laid out, they put an avenue right up the center of Manhattan that was seen from the very start as prime residential territory. So the story of Fifth Avenue is really the playing out of that vision that the commissioners had right from the beginning. Put your best residential area in the center of the island. Well, the story of Fifth Avenue then begins at its beginning in Washington Square, one of the city's great oases, with an interesting history. Way back in the 17th century, this land, actually quite a ways north of the city itself, was allocated to free slaves as a place for them to settle. The vision for that was a little bit skewed because the idea was unspoken, but the idea was the slaves were there to serve as a buffer between the Native American tribes to the north and the Dutch settlers to the south. Well, as things developed in 1797, the city purchased all the land around what's now Washington Square to become a potter's field, a burial place for those who had no other place to be interred. In 1826, and that's what you see on the slide here, the area was converted to a parade ground, and it began to attract residential settlers. In 1834, New York University arrived. These are its original buildings here in the background. And then finally, in 1849, it became a park. All of this made Washington Square a particularly attractive place for people to live. And construction in the 1830s began with a handsome row of townhouses along the park's northern side. They're built of red brick. They had marble trim, careful classical detailing. They were understated and elegant in a style that recalled, or at least was intended to recall, that of the great classical past, Greek revival. Now, there are lots of nice associations that come with ancient Greece. Democracy was one of those, and that made it a particularly attractive style for the young American democracy. It's also the moment, by the way, when the Greek War of Independence was going on, so it's some natural identification between America and Greece. Today, this row along the north of Washington Square miraculously survives almost entirely intact. These are the facades in any way are intact. The buildings behind have been redeveloped, but you can see that they retain a good deal of that elegance, whether it's in the surrounds of the doors, the classical detailing, or in some cases the original wrought iron fencing that still is there. These homes long attracted prosperous and successful bankers, merchants, and lawyers. Henry James' grandmother, for example, lived at number 18, and he used his experience visiting her there for his novel Washington Square. Now, the next generation of houses that we'll look at developed not on the square itself, but around the corner on Fifth Avenue. But before we go there, we need to pause for just a moment to talk about the Washington Arch. Now, in 1889, America had reached the 100th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration. And a man named William Rhinelander Stewart, who lived at the corner of Fifth Avenue and Washington Square North, decided that this needed a proper commemoration. So he raised private funds for a temporary wood and plaster arch to commemorate this centennial. The design was by the celebrated architect Stanford White, and it was an enormous success. You see people in this wonderful newspaper print out admiring the arch that actually spanned Fifth Avenue just north of the park. And I think it's worth pausing to note that the arch commemorating the Washington Centennial spanned Fifth Avenue. It didn't span Broadway. It didn't stand in front of Federal Hall downtown on Wall Street, where Washington actually took his oath of office. It was not near the site of the presidential mansion where Washington lived. It was on Fifth Avenue. And I think that's a powerful reflection of the increased status that this Central Avenue was quickly building up. Well, as I said, the arch was a great success. And a few years later, in 1895, the decision was made to replace the temporary arch with a permanent one. Stanford White was again the architect, and this time the material was this gleaming white Tuckahoe marble from upstate. There's wonderful carving by Frederick McMonnies and the spandrels there. And then a few years after the arch was put up, these two statues by the artist Patrick Martini were added to the northern side of it. One of them shows George Washington as a soldier, and the other as a statesman. Well, we're now back onto Fifth Avenue proper, and we need to look at developments there. And probably the best way to start is with the first major mansion erected on Fifth Avenue. This is the house of a man named Henry Brevoort. It was built at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 9th Street in 1834 as the first freestanding mansion on Fifth Avenue. It was significant. Mr. Brevoort built it because he was one of the largest landowners in the area. He controlled a good deal of the land immediately to the north of the park and did very well developing it, not just for himself, but for others. Well, Brevoort soon had a lot of company, and by the 1850s, both sides of Fifth Avenue between Washington Square and 14th Street were lined with an nearly unbroken row of solid, dignified brownstone houses. Now, you've noticed between the 1830s, when we had those red brick with white trim Greek Revival houses, we've switched styles now, and the inspiration has turned from Greece to Italy, and the detailing has become a bit bolder, and the material has turned into this what we think of as characteristic New York brownstone material, brown stone. Now, this house is the only one of that unbroken line that survives today. It's currently the home of the Salamagundi Club. It's built in 1852 for a man named Irad Hawley, who was a big coal magnate, millionaire from exploiting that resource. Well, when houses like Mr. Hawley's went up, amenities soon followed. This included churches like Ascension Church by Richard Upjohn in 1840, the first church on Fifth Avenue, or just a few years later, the place that's pictured here. This is First Presbyterian Church, just a few blocks to the north. Mr. Brevoort continued to develop things. In 1845, he built a hotel on the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 8th Street. This is not unfortunately named Hotel Brevoort. And it had a long history. It actually remained in place until 1952. Lots of things happened here. Mark Twain lived there in 1904. And in 1927, this was the place where Charles Lindbergh went to collect his reward for his solo flight across the Atlantic. In the early 20th century, as the neighborhood north of Washington Square became increasingly bohemian, many of the occupants of the private mansions, like Mr. Hawley's there, decided to move on. They sought homes further north. And those homes were either converted into boarding houses, or they were ultimately demolished to make way for the rows of apartment houses that now dominate the blocks along Fifth Avenue south of 12th Street. And I show you three of them here. The earliest one on the left there is 43 Fifth Avenue. dates to 1905. 24 Fifth Avenue in the center, designed by Emery Roth in 1924. And my personal favorite, one of the great Art Deco skyscraper apartment buildings in New York. This is 1 Fifth Avenue by Harvey Wiley Corbett that went up in 1927. Well, this development pattern of private houses, ultimately replaced by either commercial buildings or apartment houses, marched straight up the avenue. But it's when we get to 34th Street that we begin to see some really interesting things happening. That story begins in 1852, when John Jacob Astor III built this house on Fifth Avenue at the corner of 33rd Street. See, it's a fairly sober building itself. Just a few years later, in 1856, his cousin, William B. Astor, and his formidable wife, Caroline, who insisted on being known as the Mrs. Astor, built this house on the other end of the same block. Large, sober, it's understated, made, of course, of brownstone. This was the 1850s, after all. And it has the kind of characteristic feeling of what we now think of, I think, as old New York. It's discreet and unshowy on the exterior, concentrating all its luxury on the inside. This was, after all, the place where Mrs. Astor had her celebrated ballroom that accommodated 400 people, which constituted, in her view, all the people worth knowing and entertaining in New York City. Now, this cozy arrangement of the two Astors, who, by the way, did not get along particularly well on the Soon block, was destined to change. Trouble lay ahead for Mrs. Astor, and in 1869, the wildly successful department store magnate, A.T. Stewart, hired the architect John Kellum to build a very different sort of house directly across the street from Mrs. Astor. Instead of understated brownstone, quiet detailing, sitting right on the street, this building is tall, it's freestanding, it was made of white marble, it had a bold mansard roofs, prominent detailing. It was a very assertive, look at me kind of house, what we might think of as an 1860s McMansion. Now, the Stewart House signaled the beginning of a major change in taste, the taste of new money, people who made their funds rather than inheriting it. The attitude, to a certain extent, was if you got it, flaunt it. And we're going to see that the Stewart mansion set the stylistic tone for an explosion of mansions that arose along Fifth Avenue, farther to the north. But we're not yet done with the corner of 34th Street and Fifth Avenue. In 1890, John Jacob Astor, the owner of the southern of the two Astor houses, decided he was fed up with New York and moved to England. He had valuable property in his home there, and he decided to demolish it and replace it with a hotel. This is the Waldorf Hotel. As you see, a formidable building. This, however, left the house on the other end of the block, his Aunt Caroline's house, marooned with a giant commercial building immediately next door. It was a kind of really family feud played out in real estate. Mrs. Astor finally capitulated, and in 1897, she too sold her house and built a second hotel. This was the Astoria, and family disagreements were patched up. The two hotels were linked and became the first Waldorf Astoria Hotel, New York's most luxurious, famous, and fashionable hostelry with nearly 1,300 rooms. Now, that hotel lasted a very, very long time, all the way to 1929. Even though fashion had moved north, the hotel hung on. But in 29, it breathed its last and was torn down to be replaced by this building, which I'm sure you'll recognize, the Empire State Building. It's quite a saga, isn't it? From the Astors through the hotel to the great Empire State. Now, wealthy residents were not the only group to continue marching northward along Fifth Avenue. Retail, too, was on the march, and a seismic event took place in 1905 when retailer Benjamin Altman relocated his store from 6th Avenue on the Ladies Mile northeast to the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, diagonally across the street from the Waldorf Astoria. Astor's rationale was simple. 5th Avenue had cachet. It was also where his would-be clients lived, so he wanted to be close to them. He was also aware, Altman, that there were two major railway terminals currently under construction, Grand Central Terminal to the north, Penn Station to the west, and that those terminals had the potential to bring clients from the suburbs into the city to shop at his store. When Altman needed to design his building, he went to the architects Trowbridge and Livingston and said, "I'd like a new kind of department store, please. I'd like it to be serious. I'd like it to be dignified. I think the right stylistic inspiration should be the palaces of the Italian Renaissance. I don't want it to be flashy. I don't want it to look like, for example, the old Lord and Taylor store downtown on 6th Avenue. This is 5th Avenue. We need a different look." And Italian Palazzo was that look. About the same time as Altman was opening his store, Tiffany's, the celebrated jewelers, also moved to 5th Avenue, this time to 37th Street, and they hired Stanford White to design this Italian Renaissance palazzo for them, based on the Palazzo Grimani in Venice. Diagonally across the street on 36th Street, White was called in again to provide a new home for Tiffany's competitors, the jewelers Gorham. This one went up in 1904, and this time White stuck with another Italian model, but this time Florence rather than Venice. Others followed. Lord and Taylor moved from that extraordinarily gaudy building that I showed you a moment ago in the little image to a very handsome building in 1913 on 5th Avenue, and Arnold Constable, there on the right, followed a year later. The Constable building, by the way, has been handsomely converted into the Stavros Niarchos Library, a branch of the New York Public. Now, this might be a moment to take a little break and talk a bit about the Fifth Avenue Association, which played such a key role in setting and maintaining the special character of the avenue. In 1907, shortly after these stores that I just showed you moved to Fifth Avenue, the traditional residents of the street grew concerned, and they got together and formed an association to lobby as a way of controlling the commercial development of the street on which they lived. They were determined to keep Fifth Avenue special. For example, they decreed that, or they got the city to arrange anyway, that Fifth Avenue would be one of the only avenues in New York never to have a subway running underneath, or a horse car or a street railway running on its surface. The only thing on Fifth Avenue were buses, and that remains the case to this day. Now, Fifth Avenue Association also pressed for zoning limitations in 1917 that prevented the construction of factory lofts within several blocks on either side of Fifth Avenue. They lobbied to control the height of the buildings that were built there. And to this very day, you'll see no illuminated signs or parking lots anywhere along Fifth Avenue. That's all due to the lobbying of the Fifth Avenue Association. Well, let's jump ahead now to another major intersection. This is 42nd Street. In 1842, New York received its first reliable supply of clean fresh water when the Croton Aqueduct was opened. And that aqueduct, which flowed down from Westchester County, ended up here in this receiving reservoir at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street. The Egyptian-style reservoir, quite a formidable building, remained in place until 1911, when it was replaced by an even more formidable building. This, of course, is the great New York Public Library, the first of the major public institutions, great monumental buildings that we're going to encounter along Fifth. It's a wonderful place, not just to do research, but simply to wander through. A great place that gives dignity to the city and to the activities of its citizens. Now, this section of Fifth Avenue from 42nd Street north to Central Park very quickly also became a neighborhood of churches. And in the 1880s, there were no less than 7 churches on Fifth Avenue between 43rd and 56th Street. Excuse me. Today, only 3 of these remain. St. Thomas's on the left, St. Patrick's Cathedral there in the center, and the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church on the right. And just as those churches sort of disappeared over the years, leaving only these 3, migrating congregations moved north, and the brownstones that once were between these churches disappeared to create a street of offices, of commercial buildings, and in a great triumph, one of New York's most remarkable civic spaces. Built from 1931 to 1939, Rockefeller Center is an astonishing blend of art and commerce, business, entertainment, a kind of city planning triumph, and it remains one of Fifth Avenue's signature attractions. Now, this centrality of Fifth Avenue with business, with transportation nearby at Grand Central Terminal, with offices and great civic buildings nearby, also made this a neighborhood in which private clubs flourished. This is the first of those to rise. It's the Century Association, again, a spectacular Italianate design by Stanford White. And in fact, his firm, McKim, Mead & White, went on to design these 2 clubs. This is the University Club on 54th Street, there on the left, and the Metropolitan Club a little bit further north on 61st. Still some of the great public buildings or private buildings in New York. Now, even with all this development, fashionable residential life in Midtown continued in the middle of the 19th century. And from the 1880s onwards, Fifth Avenue in the 50s was Vanderbilt country. The family developed no less than 8 increasingly elaborate mansions in the 50s along Fifth Avenue, including the William H. Vanderbilt Triple Palace there on the right on 51st Street, and culminating in the enormous house, the Cornelius Vanderbilt II, built for his family at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street on what is now the site of Bergdorf Goodman's. Virtually all of those original Vanderbilt houses are now gone and replaced. Now, when we get to 59th Street, or to 58th Street, really, we arrive at Grand Army Plaza, one of the great intersections of Manhattan. Intersection has the Plaza Hotel, of course. Over here was the site of the old Vanderbilt mansion that for years faced right onto the Pulitzer Fountain, donated by the newspaper publisher down here. There's also the site of Augustus St. Gaudens's spectacular gilded statue of General William Tecumseh Sherman, who faces south towards the fountain, and of course the Plaza Hotel. But more than anything else, this neighborhood was the place where Fifth Avenue met Central Park. Think about that. New York's most fashionable avenue and New York's most beautiful green space meeting right at this spot. And in fact, Central Park was the key factor that set the character of Fifth Avenue from 59th Street north to 110th. Who wouldn't want to live on Fifth Avenue with the park as your front yard? But for all of that, these blocks were unusually slow to develop. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. One was fashion. The Vanderbilts were living a little to the south. That's where fashion lived, and no one wanted to be the first person to move into an unyet fashion-approved neighborhood. And the other one was zoning. Wealthy New Yorkers were simply tired of moving. Every time it seems that they built a new house, commerce encroached on them and pushed them farther north, and that became tiresome and expensive. Then two things happened. The first was a zoning change was put into place, barring all commercial development along Fifth Avenue between 59th and 110th Street. The second one had to do with fashion. You remember our friend Caroline Astor, whose house down on 34th Street and Fifth Avenue was threatened by hotel building. Well, she decided in 1893 that she would be that pioneer to move north. And this is the building that she built for herself on Fifth Avenue and 65th Street. Looks very different from her old house, doesn't it? Instead of solid brownstone respectability and understatement, you've got a French chateau dropped here from the Loire Valley with every kind of architectural flourish and gewgaw imaginable. Mrs. Astor fully embraced the new style that a few years earlier, when the Stuart House went up, she herself had turned her nose up to it. So these are new houses going up for new people, and Mrs. Astor's home opened the floodgates. And for the next 20 years, there was along this stretch of Fifth Avenue a simply unprecedented explosion of the building of private mansions. People moved in droves, and the only big question they had is, what kind of house should they build? You know, how ambitious and flamboyant do I want to be? What style do I want for my house? You could look at what kind of associations that style evoked, what your personal taste was. And for example, like Mrs. Astor, you could build a Loire Valley chateau, as Isaac Fletcher and Felix Warburg did in these two designs by C.P.H. Gilbert. Or if you identified with the current architectural fabrications of Beaux-Arts Paris, you could build a Belle Epoque house, as the Edith and Ernesto Fabri did on 62nd Street there on the left, or as Oliver Gould and Henry Sloane did on 72nd Street on the right. Or if you still wanted to stay with things French, but wanted something perhaps a little less flamboyant, you could emulate the Place de Vosges, as William Starr Miller did on 86th Street, or commission something like Harris Fahnestock did on 66th Street, emulating a much more cool and classic mode. Well, all of that went along, and then other styles came in too. After the turn of the century, there was a very quick revival of interest in the styles of Georgian England and Federal style America. So you get houses like Willard Strait's house of 1913 here on the left, or the Emily Trevor house on 90th Street on the right. Red brick classical detailing are back. And then, of course, Italy remained perennially popular. Consider the house that the publisher Joseph Pulitzer built for himself that emulates a Venetian palazzo, or the one that Otto Kahn built for himself that looks exactly like the Palazzo Cancelleria in Rome, or this house that emulates a smaller, slightly more modest house in Florence. The variety was seemingly endless. Now, a great deal of change has taken, and most of these houses are now either converted to other use or hemmed in by less interesting buildings or by apartment houses. But there's one remarkable block on Fifth Avenue that remains intact. This is a block between 78th and 79th Street that was developed by a man named Henry Cook. He bought the entire block and put in place right from the start covenants that specified that only private houses could be built there. And those covenants hold today, with the result that you get these buildings like the Payne Whitney house that you see here on the right. This was one of Stanford White's last works that set the tone for this remarkable block that you can just walk around and marvel that these fantastic buildings have survived. The Whitney House, by the way, now is the home of the cultural services of the French Embassy. There's a wonderful bookshop inside, and also one of the most remarkable interiors, not just that Stanford White designed, but that survive in New York City. This is his so-called Venetian room, fantasy of gold and mirrors, and it remains intact. And the consulate people are very happy to welcome you in and let you have a look. Now, all these mansions couldn't last forever. What we saw happening further south, apartments replacing homes, happened on Upper Fifth Avenue as well. And this was the building that pioneered it all. This is 998 Fifth Avenue, built by the McKim Mead and White firm in 1910. This was the building that made apartment living socially acceptable. The developer here knew we had an uphill strive. You know, their apartments had a kind of unsavory reputation. You know, respectable people lived in their own homes, and the developer here, who was Douglas Elliman, decided he needed to get some change made here. So he lured former Vice President Levi Morton to the building. He brought in Murray Guggenheim of the Guggenheim family and Secretary of State Elihu Root, and he told them if they would move into this building at very, very favorable rates, he would love to have them. And they did. And instantly, with celebrities like this, the building became somehow a place where everyone wanted to live. Now, living here was not necessarily a step down after a mansion. This very, very large apartment building had only 17 units in it, some simplexes and some duplexes. So you were living in very large and commodious accommodations. Well, in 1910, 998 Fifth Avenue was still an outlier. But by 1920, the economies of keeping a mansion going, their ownership, were becoming increasingly problematic. It was expensive. It needed a lot of staff. Taxes were rising. And there was great pressure for mansion owners to sell up and to move to someplace more manageable, a place like 998 Fifth Avenue, or to one of the other apartment houses that followed it. In fact, between 1923 and 1929, fully 1/3 of Fifth Avenue was redeveloped. Houses were demolished at a rate that was just as astonishing as the rate at which they had been built in the decades before. And large apartment houses, some of them offering unprecedented size and luxury, grew up in their place. Buildings that were designed by a small group of architects like James Carpenter here, or Warren and Wetmore, or Rosario and Candela. And you'll notice nearly all of them are built on the model of Italian palazzos. Happily, these apartment buildings did not replace all of the mansions on Fifth Avenue, and those that survive are now happy homes to foundations, to schools, to consulates, or to museums. The stretch of Fifth Avenue from 79th Street north to 110th is, of course, Museum Mile, one of the world's great cultural corridors. There are at least a dozen remarkable institutions focused on the arts in these blocks. They include the Museum of the City of New York here at the top, or a converted mansion. This was Andrew Carnegie's home that's become the Cooper Hewitt Museum, or New York's only Frank Lloyd Wright building, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. But the real anchor to the Museum of Mile is, of course, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And its story as the second great Beaux-Arts masterpiece with the Public Library on Fifth Avenue is an interesting one, because the museum, which is the only building in Central Park that is not a part of the park, has extraordinary development, because when it was first built in 1874, when the first buildings of it were built up, it faced resolutely into the park. In 1874, remember, Fifth Avenue had not yet been developed this far north as a residential or desirable location. All of that changed in 1894 at the very height of the mansion building boom, when architect Richard Morris Hunt came onto the scene and literally reoriented the building away from the park, which had been its first focus, onto Fifth Avenue itself. And he's the one that built this imposing central pavilion and the Great Central Hall inside. Fifth Avenue once again asserting itself as the focus of civic life, residential life, and fashion in New York City. Now, when we get to 110th Street, things change rather dramatically. This moment we enter Harlem, and this section of Fifth Avenue, the stretch from 110th to 120th Street, was long a transitional one. There was very little transportation up that far. We're north of the park, and it was slow to develop. Very little went on. Today, however, very little of what did eventually develop there remains. So it's hard to get a sense of what the area looked like originally. It's all been completely redeveloped over the last 30 years. And what's there instead of the rather simple buildings that were built there are buildings like these. Now this nice apartment house up here by Roberta Washington, a Manhattan architect, built in 2007. And very interestingly, down below here, these are the Fifth Avenue Partnership houses. It's a full block between 117th and 118th Street that were put up in 2001 to deliberately try to bring back the idea of a New York row house. You'll notice that each of these buildings, designed to be owned by a single owner, has a stoop that leads up to a major apartment on the upper floor, but also has a rental apartment on the lower levels as well. So they're meant to be self-sustaining. Well, as I mentioned, this was a transitional area earlier on, and it developed slowly. But when it did develop, it happened in an unusual way. At the turn of the 20th century, due to a lot of construction on roads and bridges down on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and also to the provisions of the 1901 Tenement House Act, and a very, very large population of Eastern European Jews from the Lower East Side moved northwards and settled in these blocks, to the point that by 1900, the area from 110th to 120th Street in South Harlem was the third largest Jewish community in the world. There were synagogues up here everywhere, and I show you these two as examples of two of those buildings that survive, converted to other uses today. Now at 120th Street, Fifth Avenue undergoes another change because it's interrupted, runs smack into what was originally Mount Morris and is now Marcus Garvey Park. You may know that most of Harlem is a flat plain and easy to build on, easy to develop. But the exception is Marcus Garvey Park. It's a huge rock outcropping that defied easy development. And recognizing this, the city acquired it early on and designated it as a park. They also used it as a site for one of the numerous fire towers that once dotted high ground around the city. These were built and staffed so that people could watch for potential blazes as they developed. Large bells were rung and firemen were called. All of them are gone, with one exception, and that's this one on the right here. This is James Bogardus's fire tower in Mount Morris Park, put up in 1855. Now, as I said, Mount Morris Park did defy development, but by the 1880s, elevated train lines were being built north into Harlem. They ran along 2nd Avenue, along 3rd Avenue, and along 9th Avenue, and with that, development took off. We saw that it developed south of the park as an intensely populated area of Eastern European Jews. The area to the west of the park, on the other hand, developed rather differently into one of New York's most fashionable brownstone neighborhoods. And today, these blocks adjacent to the park survive as some of the most extraordinary brownstone places still surviving in the city. This was very much an upscale neighborhood. It was the home for doctors, lawyers, politicians. The mayor lived in one of these houses here for a number of years. And in addition to brownstone row houses, you even get some freestanding mansions like this one built by John and Nancy Dwight, who owned a baking powder company. Wonderful Italianate design. Now, north of 125th Street, Fifth Avenue was developed and today remains largely residential. And it's a fascinating mix of private homes, of public housing, and some very creative solutions to urban living. There are also up here some fascinating survivors from an earlier day. These houses, one on 128th Street and the other on 129th, actually are built of wood and date back to the time before Harlem was actually a part of New York City, when it was an independent and largely rural farming community. And there are little gems like this dotted through the blocks off Fifth Avenue in the 120s. Also mentioned this was an area where there were some very interesting pioneering experiments in subsidized housing. The earliest of these dates to 1880 to 83, so-called Astor Row on 130th Street. This was a group of 28 matching houses that were erected by our friends the Astors, in this case William B. Astor, on land that the family had owned for decades. What Astor thought he would do is create a kind of model community. He paired 3-story houses, each of which was set well back from the street. They all have front porches that are to them. They are designed specifically with space between the buildings so that light and air can penetrate. And it's very good news that they are now systematically being renovated and once again seen as very, very livable and attractive solutions to life in a major city. A little farther north, between 138th and 142nd Street, is this building. This is the Riverbend complex built by the firm Davis Brody in 1967. We all think of public housing as fairly dreary places, crime-ridden, long corridors, faceless. This building tried to work against that. Every apartment here has its own balcony. Many of them are duplexes that interlock with other apartments. And behind all these buildings are a series of raised platforms and walkways that have playgrounds, gathering places, and connections to let you visit between your neighbors. Clever and very desirable solution. Now, Harlem is also a great neighborhood of churches, and many of the best are either on or near Fifth Avenue. I can show you here the Harlem Presbyterian Church there on the top by Thomas Poole. That faces right onto Marcus Garvey Park. On the right, this is the Reformed Low Dutch Church of Harlem, dates to 1885. And then maybe the best of all, St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, a wonderful building on Fifth Avenue and 127th Street from 1872. This building actually was originally located about 2 blocks to the east. The congregation wanted very much to be on Fifth Avenue and hired the architect to literally dismantle the old church and rebuild it again on the new site. And then around the corner, truly spectacular building. This is All Saints Roman Catholic Church on 129th Street. The architect here is James Renwick, who you may know is also the designer of St. Patrick's Cathedral. But here his inspiration was not medieval France, but was Italy during the Renaissance. And if the church is spectacular, the school building next door is equally so. Well, we're running out of steam and we're running out of space. And finally, at 142nd Street, we arrive at the northernmost building on Fifth Avenue. This is the 369th Regimental Armory, built from 1930 to 33. And it's the home of the celebrated Harlem Hellfighters. It's interesting that Vertner Tandy, who was New York's first registered black architect, was the commander of the Hellfighters, and that none other than Bill Bojangles Robinson was the drum major of the band. the Armory building provides us with a nice kind of symmetry with which to finish our tour. Yes, remember, we began with a triumphal arch downtown on Washington Square, and we're finishing with another one here at the upper tip of Fifth Avenue, where it fades into the Harlem River. And that's it. We made it all the way from Washington Square to 142nd Street. And the only thing for me to say now is thank you for joining me on the walk. And if you'd like to know more, there's a reminder of the book, which is available for purchase. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Hennessey. That was fascinating. We do have a couple of questions. What did the research process look like when you were starting your venture on the book?
Generally, this is the second book I've done that have been walking tours, and they usually begin actually with walking, starting at one end of a street or a spot on a street and looking around and saying, that's an interesting building. I wonder why it looks the way it does. Why was it built? What were the circumstances that brought it into existence? And from there, you start answering the questions that your experience on the street raises.
Oh, thank you. Another question someone writes, are you familiar with the book Empty Mansions? Did Huguette Clark have a home on Fifth Avenue?
She did. She did indeed have a home on Fifth Avenue. I think it was in the 60s. I'd have to look up the exact spot, but yes, absolutely.
Someone else also asks, are these buildings being protected?
Virtually all of the surviving mansions along Upper Fifth Avenue are in fact individually landmarked, and so very well protected. There are also, Fifth Avenue also is a kind of sequence of historic districts. So everything really from 59th Street North to 110th, and then again, the buildings immediately around Marcus Garvey Park are part of historic districts. Those downtown in the Village as well. So Fifth Avenue is in pretty good shape. That's not to say that unfortunate things sneak in, but by and large, we're in pretty good shape.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Mr. Hennessey, thank you for spending your evening with us. It was a fascinating lecture. I will send an email to the group again, as your publisher was generous to offer us a discount on the book. It would make excellent holiday gifts. But thank you for spending your evening with us, and I appreciate you talking to the Stanford community.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I wish everybody a wonderful evening and a wonderful holiday. Thank you.